following is a work of fiction and should not be taken as actual history.
Meet Professor Roger Hill, historian, adventurer, and raconteur extraordinaire. He travels to parallel worlds where history went differently and brings back lectures on his findings. So grab a prime seat, pay attention, and take good notes. This is Alternate History 100. Welcome to the class.
Good morning. Having lived in the opening years of the 2020s, you're quite familiar with the concept of a pandemic. I want to talk today about an earlier pandemic, the Black Plague, a disease that began in Central Asia and traveled via trade routes into Europe. Arriving there in 1348, it sparked a pandemic that killed 30 to 60% of the population. That's as many as 48 million people. A death toll so high, it took 200 years to get the world population back to pre-plague levels. And yet, it could have been worse. I just got back from a world where the death toll in Europe was not 30%, or 40, or 50, or 60. Do I hear 70? 70! Can I get 80? 80! I've got 80. Will someone see 90? Anyone? There's 90. Anyone else? Going once, going twice. Sold to the Grim Reaper for 90% of the population of Europe. Thank you. I make light, and really I shouldn't, because it was basically the end of Western civilization in that world. Or was it? Now, there as here, the plague did eventually come to an end. But what do you think happened next? Well, as they say in science, nature abhors a vacuum. Cutting Europe's population from 80 million to 8 million meant there was a lot of vacant land and nobody to defend it. And since the plague had subsided, there were neighbors eager to take advantage, like fat kids discovering an unlocked bakery. As in our world, the Turks attacked Byzantium in 1356. But there, their campaign was much more successful. All of southeastern Europe was under their control within a decade. And in 1358, the Moors, who in our world were being expelled from Spain and Italy, came back in spades, quickly retaking Sicily, conquering all of the Iberian Peninsula, and beginning a push into France and the Italian mainland. Everywhere they went, they forcibly converted the surviving Europeans to Islam and slaughtered those who would not go along. And they went out of their way to destroy churches and cathedrals. Down came the almost new Cathedral of Notre Dame. Down came the still under construction Cologne Cathedral. And the cities of Tours and Poitiers, where Charles Martel had beaten the Muslims some 600 years before, were razed, with orders from the Caliph not to leave one stone piled upon another. A small but determined wave of Christians fled before the invasion. Many of them wound up in England, where an intense labor shortage made newcomers welcome. With Rome under occupation, England sent envoys to the unconquered lands of Ireland, Norway, and Sweden in an attempt to elect a new pope and establish a new Holy See. After much squabbling, they set up the see in London in the year 1366. But they had a hell of a time filling the papacy. Archbishop Simon Islip was elected pope and died within a month. Then came William Edgington, who also passed away before the year was over. As they gathered for the third time in less than 12 months, one of the Irish delegates muttered, "Maybe God doesn't want an Englishman running his church." The Muslims on the continent were aware of all this and contemplated an invasion of England. King Edward III knew that he did not have the manpower to make a counterstrike, but he did take measures to be ready if an attack should come. As in our world, where an invasion by the French seemed possible in the 14th century, laws were passed requiring all men to practice archery. But due to the decimation of the population in that world, women were also called forth. As Boadicea fought for this land long ago, so shall the fair of England do today, should the need arise. Thank you. And arise it did. When Edward died in 1377, his 10-year-old grandson Richard II came to the English throne. The Muslims saw this as their opportunity to strike and sent a force across the Channel. Landing near Hastings, they were met by a smaller English army and slaughtered in huge numbers by the archers of both sexes. And the part that women played in repelling the invasion influenced the movement towards freedom and equality in the England of that world. Now let me just review how things went in our world. The Black Plague wiped out a huge percentage of the population. This increased the value of labor and helped bring an end to feudalism. Gunpowder came and made obsolete the huge castles that had dominated Europe. The Renaissance brought a revival in art, knowledge, and thought. The printing press helped spread the revival across the continent. The Age of Discovery brought new wealth and altered the entire balance of power among the European nations. The Reformation ended the Church's stranglehold on thought and helped usher in the Age of Science, which in turn made possible everything we know today. The end of feudalism, gunpowder, the Renaissance, the printing press, the Age of Discovery, the Reformation. Write those 6 things down. They were the blocks that built the bridge from medieval times to the modern age. But that's our world. Let's look at what happened over there. There as here, feudalism ended largely because of labor shortages. Over there, you can add the heroics of the female archers in England and the imposition of a new order on the continent. That meant that their end of feudalism actually came sooner than it did in our world. Tick off feudalism. There as here, gunpowder was invented in China and reached Europe via trading. In our world, Europeans improved the formula and used their superior metalworking knowledge to build stronger and better projectile-firing weapons. So when the Portuguese arrived in China, it was the West who had the advantage in weapons technology, despite the Chinese having a head start on gunpowder by centuries. But over there, the decimation of the European population greatly slowed that progress. Yes, there were people working on firearms before the plague hit. And yes, some of them survived. And some of them escaped to England, and some stayed where they were and converted to Islam. That made their Germany of 1380 kind of like our Germany of 1945, with the Americans and Russians trying to grab the best rocket scientists. And in both situations, both sides got some valuable people. So yes, gunpowder weapons did improve and eventually come to the fore in that world, but it happened a lot later than it did in ours. Tick off gunpowder. The Renaissance. There as here, it began before the plague, but the Muslim invasion of the continent brought it to an abrupt end. Humanism was crushed as an apostasy. The wonderful paintings and sculptures of our world never came to be because Islam forbade artists to make representations of living things. So over there, nobody has heard of Da Vinci or Michelangelo. If those men were ever even born, they never found patrons, never created their masterpieces, and were, in all likelihood, executed for being gay. Tick off the Renaissance. The printing press. There as here, it was an Asian invention. The Chinese were using carved wooden blocks to print books in the 9th century. They had developed movable type using characters made of clay by the 11th century. By the 14th century, both the Chinese and Koreans were printing with movable metal type. So, like gunpowder, Asia had a big head start on Europe in this field. But one of the things that prevented them from exploiting that head start was the complexity of their written languages. Chinese, for example, does not have an alphabet. It is a language where the characters represent syllables. And I read that an educated Chinese person would know about 4,000 characters. Imagine how long that would take to recite, compared with our ABC song. The simplicity of Western alphabets made it much easier for the printing press to take off in the West. And I don't mean to diss Herr Gutenberg because it doesn't matter whether the printing press was his idea or just something he heard about from Asia. He can at very least be credited with improvements in making type and ink and the whole process of printing. And before we go to that other world, Let's look at what happened in ours one more time. We had the printing press invented in East Asia and make its way to Europe, where it blossomed. But what do you suppose happened in the Muslim lands between those two civilizations? Nobody? Well, if they were printing books in China in the 800s and in Europe in the 1400s, when do you assume they printed the first book in Arabic?
1200.
Tiffany says 1200, splitting the difference, and that's a logical assumption that the printing press would come across from East Asia, land in the Middle East, and move on to Europe. But it's not what happened. Point of fact, they did not have the printing press in the Ottoman Empire until the 18th century. And why do you suppose that happened?
Repression.
Right. Because Muslim theocrats sat on the technology. The press was prohibited in the Ottoman Empire until 1729. There were some books printed in Arabic before that, but they came from European shops. In that world, with Europe occupied by Ottomans and Moors, and no guy named Gutenberg ever born, printing simply didn't happen. Or at least, not for a very, very long time. Tick off the printing press. The Age of Exploration. Why do I think I need a trumpet for that one? In our world, Europe had traded with Asia by land routes for centuries. Indeed, that's how the Black Plague came to Europe. But they still wanted the silks, and especially the spices of Asia. Apparently, rotten meat seasoned with cardamom is actually palatable. To them. In our world's 1453, the Ottomans took Constantinople and shut the door on trade with the West. Europe still wanted and needed those Asian goods, and that's when they began to wonder about reaching Asia by sailing west. They had, of course, grossly underestimated the size of the world, but their error led them to wealth and power derived from the colonization of the Americas. Over there, Constantinople fell almost 100 years earlier than it did in our world. But because most of Europe quickly fell to Muslim rule, the ban on trade did not last long. So the people who lived in Spain had no need to try to reach Asia by sailing west. And the people who lived in Portugal had no need to try to reach Asia by sailing around Africa. Only the northern unconquered parts of Europe had such a need. And when England sent an expedition in 1497 that discovered Newfoundland, they did not make the mistake of thinking they were in Asia. They found no gold, no cities, and apart from great fishing, saw no reason to return. And thus it took a very long time before any real interaction with the Americas came to be. Tick off the Age of Exploration. The Reformation. You might think that without the thought changes that came with the Renaissance, and the printing press to spread them, that the Reformation never happened. But that's not entirely so. As in our world, John Wycliffe was born before the plague and did the same things that he did here, attacking the authority of the church, seeking a Bible-based spiritual revival, and translating the Bible into English. The movement of the Holy See from Rome to London, which removed the heavy Italian influence from the church, made that process a little easier for him. The idea spread, and Bibles were also translated into the native languages of the other unconquered nations. And the Latin Rite disappeared, which caused a bit of a religious schism, but most people came to prefer hearing services in their native tongue. So even though nobody nailed a thesis to the door of a church, things did change in Christianity, just not the way they did here. Tick off Reformation. Let's take a look at how things went in the rest of that world in the years after 1400. Like here, there was a robust commerce in the Indian Ocean, with Arab traders doing business with Asia and Africa. It had been going on for 1,000 years. And with no Portuguese showing up to alter the playing field, it just continued. Like here, the Chinese got in on this for a time. They had massive treasure fleets. But when the Yongle Emperor died in 1424, those fleets were brought home. The new Hongzhi emperor thought they were a waste of resources and put an end to the trading and exploratory missions. And though he reigned for just a year, the ban on the missions remained. China pulled in on itself, just like here. Like here, Japan went through a series of struggles. The Tokugawa family came to power in 1603 and soon after cut off contact with outsiders. Just like here. So that leaves the world in their 1619 with two isolationist groups in East Asia, a thriving but stagnant three-cornered trade system based in the Indian Ocean, a continental Europe whose potential age of progress was strangled in the crib, a few divided Christian kingdoms on the edge of that, and an uncolonized Western Hemisphere. And that is where I'm going to stop. I want you to dig into the materials I've brought back and write 2,000 words comparing and contrasting the 21st century of their world with the 21st century of ours. You'll find a lot of differences to write about. That's due in 2 weeks. Class dismissed. Hi, I'm Gary Wheeler. Alternate History 100 is a labor of love with the twin goals of entertaining you and making you think. If you like what you heard today, please hit the subscribe button, give us a like, and tell your friends about us. Your word of mouth can really help this channel grow. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Until then, keep thinking and make some history of your own.
The preceding was a work of fiction and should not be taken as actual history.